Hello world, welcome back to the PG.biz podcast with your hosts, me Brian Baglow, and the glorious, globe-trotting and Gamescom endorsing Peggy and Salz. Peggy, from social media, it looks like you were one of the people at Gamescom who made the show. How are you? And welcome back.
Wow, I didn't know that. I was just doing my thing, going around checking out everything that was happening. So yeah, it was a great Gamescom and of course bringing it all back to our show, which is just in the final days actually of whether or not we are going to be voted the best of British. So this is excitement all around.
Very true, very true. If any of our listeners are inexplicably unaware of this, the PG.biz podcast, your window into the world of the global mobile games industry, has been nominated for the Listener's Choice Award in the British Podcast Awards. So, obviously, what we would like you to do is drop whatever you're doing, don't stop listening, you can multitask, and go and vote for us, because if we win, we have been assured of wealth and riches beyond imagining, but it's the power and prestige that I think we're both really after, Peggy, right?
Absolutely. And another thing to be excited about is our guest, right, Brian? Because if you're like me, and I think you are a bit like me, a little bit of a data nerd, it's always exciting to look at hot gaming trends. And that's what we have, because we have a new report just come out, chock full of data that our audience needs to know, understand. And we don't just have the data, right? We have, may I say it, the data diva. Yes, indeed, we do. We have actually a two-part series with you to dig into all the data. Lexi Sydow, your director, corporate marketing and insights, of course, at data.ai. Before we kick it off, I think we just both need to congratulate you because I think you just got a promotion.
Yes, I have. Thank you. That's very kind.
Congratulations, Lexi, and yeah, I have to agree with you, Peggy. Data geek here as well, and some of the insight and information that you can pull out of data.ai, app Annie as was, is incredible, and I have spent hours trawling through some of the reports that you guys have produced. Digging into all of the things that help differentiate the mobile world. It's the monetization techniques, it's like the live ops, it's all of the incredible sort of granular information that developers now have access to. So it's an absolute pleasure to have you here, and I'm really looking forward to this.
Oh, thank you. I'm so happy to be here. It's been a while since we've done one of these, so I'm very excited.
As Peggy says, we're going to take our time. We're going to sort of really kind of drill into this because it's just too good an opportunity not to. Um, but in your position, your new position, I should say, your passion is all about helping bring that data to life. I mean, you must have seen and analysed a lot in the last decade in the mobile world, games world, and beyond. If you had to pick an adjective to describe where we are in the current mobile gaming market, what would it be?
I think this year we're looking at stabilizing as the adjective. And then I'd add a little asterisk of, but feeling the effects of economic pressures, perhaps. We saw our first sort of decline in gaming spend last year, which was largely a result of disposable income kind of squeeze. But this year we're seeing it's outside of China, we're seeing largely a stabilization where we're seeing sort of flat growth year on year, which is ultimately positive because we weren't sure if it was going to continue with the economic pressures that everyone's feeling right now.
I think that makes sense. I think that makes an awful lot of sense because it does seem as though we've undergone a wobble. So we're here to talk about the Gaming Spotlight report and the review that you just released with IDC. Can you do the same thing? There's a lot in there that we're going to unpick. But again, do you have one word, one adjective you can use to describe this report and why you think it stands out?
Yeah, I think I'd say either robust or comprehensive. So the report looks at the kind of full spectrum of gaming. So we're looking at mobile, console, PC, Mac, and handheld. And then there's some other sort of cloud-based or cloud-streamed gaming as well. So it's a very robust report in the sense that we're trying to give a real picture of the entire lay of the land.
That's interesting in itself if you think about it, Brian, because cross-platform, it is the mantra, what I'm hearing through all of our interviews. It's about being everywhere and, handhelds, cloud. We haven't talked about it on our show as much, but our guests are talking about it.
I think we have a terrible tendency in the games world to kind of silo and compartmentalise. Console is here, PC is here, mobile is here, and it's separate to handheld. But everything exists within this ecosystem, and I think that's one of the words that we get to hear quite a lot, Peggy, is the notion of ecosystem. So something that really kind of gives the perspective and the context of this report.
So let's go through the findings in the report, starting with spend, right? Because you look at that, Lexi, you look where people are spending their time and their money, which I think is really interesting, and identified what you call pockets of spend in some pretty interesting subgenres as well, including simulation, which is a top one. So tell me about the pockets of spend and share with us what's driving the growth here.
On the whole, what we're forecasting for 2023 is $108 billion through the app stores for mobile gaming. So this doesn't include ad revenue or ad spend. And the bulk of this is pretty stable outside of China. So what we're seeing in China is still some of the headwinds from the licensing freeze and sort of that freeze, I guess, lifting up now, but there's still some slowness happening with getting those licenses for domestic games, as well as regulations around gamers, young gamers, that is. So that's another sort of area that is causing some headwinds for the global figure. But what we see for sort of these pockets of growth for spend, we do see some sort of call out areas that are driving some of the growth. And some of that is sort of relative to download. So for instance, we looked at growth in market share. So that's letting us look at who's taking over sort of that piece of the pie. So even if the pie is getting smaller or is the same size as last year, we're able to kind of see relative to other sectors, where's the money going? And part of that is looking at the downloads for what's popular. And so simulation is a great one that you mentioned. Driving simulation was the breakout sort of star of garnering that market share. We saw in terms of what's helping to drive that subgenre, Indian Bikes Driving 3D in particular is a title where 80% of those downloads are coming from India, but it's very popular from a simulation standpoint. We also saw simulation sports did extremely well last year, and that was largely due to some soccer-related titles. So FIFA Soccer, for instance, and then Football League 2023, both of which were quite popular in India, Brazil, Indonesia. FIFA Soccer also saw the US and Mexico and Turkey up at the top for downloads. And the reason I wanted to bring those up in terms of revenue is just that sort of re-engagement topically with the FIFA World Cup helps to drive that revenue. So we actually saw FIFA Soccer surpass the $1 billion milestone for its lifetime spend just this right about in the last couple of weeks. So very strong growth there. We also saw in terms of the consumer spend pockets of growth, one of the biggest areas, and it's one of the games we call out in the report, is the sector for RPG games, for role-playing games, team battle being the subgenre. And the biggest sort of growth factor here is the launch of Honkai Star Rail, which is the second big title from MiHoYo after Genshin Impact. So that one launched in April 2023 and really helped to boost a lot of revenue in that space. So those are some of the key areas. We also saw one that I'd like to call out in the party royale genre. So we tend to see Stumble Guys is the big driver there for topically for usage and for revenue and downloads. But we've seen that sector actually carve out market share in the total spend, and it's driven predominantly by Eggy Party being the breakout app. And interestingly, that is only available in China at the moment. So China iOS is already showing really strong signs of uptake. And that is a title I would keep my eyes on for the rest of the year as it begins to roll out beyond China. I think that it could be potentially a disruptive force to Stumble Guys sort of cornering that segment a bit.
So I like about your reports, you get a little peek into those trends, into the upcoming ones to watch as well. And another thing that you pointed out was the subgenres and almost like subgenres. And you also stated in the report. You think they're going a little unnoticed by publishers. So where should they be watching?
Yeah, I think it's a tricky one. It depends ultimately on your probably your geo that you're really focused on as well, because they do vary significantly, especially for downloads. But I think one of the best ways to kind of focus attention is around using that market share figure. So we like to look at sort of what are the top subgenres, and we're using Game IQ, which is our sort of taxonomy that we've categorized the whole gaming space essentially into multiple different categories. And there's primary and secondary. So you can kind of slice the data depending on what you're looking to see. In that vein, I think I would say looking at the top categories and then refiltering it by the top categories for sort of what we call breakout growth, which would be your kind of delta. But sometimes you've got some very small subgenres that, they're growing super fast, but it's from quite a small base. For instance, we saw that with hyper casual games having extreme, triple digit growth rates for revenue as some hyper casual titles try out some hybrid monetization. Very small sector, but we're seeing some traction at least in the early days. And then I'd also look at sort of your market share. So as we mentioned, sort of what's sort of taking over pieces of the pie here. And that particular metric's really interesting on a country basis. So those are the ways I'd probably look at it.
Where are you seeing, emerging genres, subgenres? What is it that you're seeing sort of growth and excitement around in any of the regions around the world?
Yeah, I think one of them that's really interesting is so match games tend to be, people tend to think of them as a pretty stable market. We all think of Candy Crush Saga as like one of the biggest titles there, and it definitely is. And in the M3 meta match area, we actually have seen Royal Match really carve out its own place in the last few years. And this one's really interesting because about 60% of the revenue at the kind of year to date is coming from the US there. And we see actually that globally, about 50% of that revenue is on iPhones, 10% is iPad, and then 40% is Android, tablet and phone combined. And I think that's really interesting that we've seen this like larger share of iPad compared to other potential titles. And then I think in this area, I don't think a lot of people thought you could break into the top charts, right? So Candy Crush has been that kind of title, and it's sort of its properties as well have been dominating. And Royal Match was number 8 for the match games in 2021 for spend, and then number 3 in 2022, and is now number 2 in H1 2023, just behind Candy Crush. So this to me is one of those areas where I think, contrary to what a lot of people would have thought, really this game was able to carve into a pretty mature segment of the mobile gaming experience. And I think a large part of that has to do, they've got some great user acquisition strategies. They've had heavy user acquisition as of last year to get people into the game, and re-engagement as well, where they saw revenue ticked up as well off of paid UA. So I think they're really re-engaging lapsed users well. And it's very story driven, which is a little bit different to Candy Crush. So this has been an interesting one. The demographics look similar, where they tend to skew female and tend to skew over 45, but they've cracked into a market. And I was looking at our cross-app usage data here, and I was surprised to find that on iOS in the US, only about 10% of Candy Crush users also played Royal Match. So to me, it's showing, it's not that they've carved out the same user base, they've actually kind of found a tangential user base. And sort of activated that. So I think that's a really interesting growth segment that I think would surprise people. Definitely surprised me.
From personal experience, I've certainly seen Royal Match pushing through. I have been very, very aware of that game in a way that I never was until the first half of this year. So yeah, whatever they're doing is clearly working. But if I may just extend on the sort of the genre, in terms of platforms, what are you seeing? What does your data show about, platform and cross-platform gaming, more importantly?
We're seeing more indications of, you got to be everywhere. And I think the cloud-based, the cloud streaming gaming is another really strong indication of that. So that's been a really interesting area that we've seen growth. Now, it is still relatively small. So we see about 30 million monthly active users on mobile, accessing cloud-based or cloud-streamed gaming, about 60 million across the ecosystem for PC, Mac as well. And when you look at that compared to mobile gaming, most popular game or the most played game of H1 outside of China, so it's just kind of globally excluding China, was Roblox at 325 million monthly active users. So the scale is very different for some mobile games, but we are seeing strong growth there. So we're actually seeing the hours spent on cloud stream gaming on a mobile phone is set to double this year. We're seeing it's carving out even more market share, almost a quarter of all time relative to sort of doing it on a computer or television. Is coming from your mobile phone. And we're expected to see about 60% revenue growth in that sector. So it's definitely got some very strong growth rates. I think mobile gaming is still going to be that core, but we are seeing indications that there's more cloud-based streaming of games happening on mobile and on your PC and Mac.
And it brings me back also to our guests very often, Brian, because they're all telling us, mobile, yes, but we're looking at web. We're looking elsewhere. We had Quali, we had Ryan on recently talking about how he's looking at Steam. And you talked about Gamescom. That's where I was learning about Nostra, which is another interesting platform that we'll be looking at here as well, Brian. But you're seeing this as well, Lexi, and you're also seeing the data behind it. We hear about the trends. The data, does that hold up this trend?
So I would say it's a very interesting trend to watch. And I think that there's some compelling areas, especially our partners at IDC who help with this report were telling us about some of the ways that there's bundling with sort of your 5G or your broadband kind of capabilities on a local scale, especially in APAC in Latin America, where there's some rollouts of packaging there to support more of that cloud stream gaming. And so that type of infrastructure can really help. But ultimately, I do think that some of the most successful titles have really tailored to their markets when they've done their localization strategy and kept in mind any sort of device specs or infrastructure, things like that when they've designed their game. So that optimization, I think, is hard to beat. But the growth rates are very compelling. I mean, just the fact that time spent in cloud stream gaming on a mobile phone has nearly doubled that alone is something to definitely watch.
So we've talked about diversification, platform genres, and gameplay, but we also need to touch on monetization because everything we're hearing is that it's tougher than ever, and to add to that difficulty, we're now finding out through your report that sentiment towards in-game ads is going down and deteriorating. So what is the answer for developers? What can they do to find new users in this, increasingly challenging climate?
It is a harder climate, especially with respect to ads. I think we expect to see that happen more when the crackdown on fingerprinting happens from a user acquisition standpoint. So still sort of waiting for that other shoe to drop, I guess. And also for Google to kind of implement their privacy framework as well. Then we'll start to see, I think, the industry figure out relatively quickly how to sort of navigate when you can't target your whales as efficiently. But for the moment, I mean, and what we've heard from publishers as well is that you can kind of get what you need through fingerprinting at the moment. But definitely to your point about sentiment, it is tricky. I do think that there is a way to have hybrid monetization to try to appeal to different user bases, especially looking at your different geos that you might be going after. But we did see that sentiment on the whole for in-game ads has dipped. What I will say is that because this is a survey and it is based on, how people feel, I do think that there's how you feel and then there's how you act. And we see this with time spent. So the average person is spending about 5.1 hours per day on their mobile phones. But when you ask people how much time they spend, it's usually a lot lower than that. So I think there's that sort of perception of, I don't like those ads very much. No, they're not as much fun for me. And this is also a US survey as well. So sentiment could be a little bit different in other markets. But it also is when you're actually playing it, maybe you don't actively act on it too much, or it's not that big a deal. But if when prompted, you might say, oh yeah, I don't really like them. So I do think that sentiment is one of those things that we have to kind of...
Again, Lexi, that's gold. Thank you. I think our listeners are going to be delighted. I've got one quick bonus question, if I may, which is, in terms of ad types, is that across the board, or are you seeing a difference between the interstitials, rewarded, playable, and in gameplay ads, as it were?
That is a great question. Not all ads are treated equal either. So the most popular ad format, the ones that people liked the most, at least in the US from this survey, were rewarded video, right? Because you're getting something in your game that makes sense for having to watch this thing. So it feels like it's gamifying watching the ad in a sense. You feel like you get something out of it. There's a clear value exchange. The second most popular, or the ones that were liked the second most, were playable ads. So that's an interesting one because that's effectively test driving a game. So presumably you've had some kind of positive experience. They work quite well with relatively simple, hyper casual games. And that gives you that kind of dopamine hit because usually you'd get through like at least part of that first level potentially. So I think there is that sort of positive sentiment there. The next ones were banner. Those ones people, they didn't love, but they weren't, the most hated, if you will. And interestingly, plain video was the most hated of all the types. So over 40% of people really didn't like them. There was sort of a 32 percentage point gap between like and dislike, and it's up from 4 years prior. So there's a significant gap there. I think ultimately, if you're playing a game, so this was surveys for people who were playing games and saw a video ad, it would probably feel it took you out of the moment, out of the gameplay. Maybe it went a little long. So I think that makes sense. If, for instance, with a rewarded video, you get something out of it that you can tie right back into your gameplay. But for just a basic video, I could see how people would not love that as an interruption.
So it all comes back to, the ad experience itself, which is more than a format, rewarded, as you pointed out. It's a little bit like the experience, so it fits and that's good. So it's about making that match with the player type, what they're likely to appreciate, where they are in the gameplay. And that comes back to context. And you're very bullish about contextual data in the report as well. What do you mean by that? What contextual data should devs be tapping in order to get their ads seen and not just served?
The more you can understand contextually about the player behind those games, so demographic data, cross-genre affinity, how much are they likely to play another genre, for instance, versus the overall population? There could be some real similarities that you see that might not be as intuitive. Sort of cross-app usage. What other apps are they using and playing? Looking at gameplay, so styles of gameplay as well, the difficulty levels, potentially average session length. So, for instance, if you are playing a game with very short sessions and you have a video ad interrupting those sessions all the time, that's probably a bit more of a negative experience versus if you have some longer session length, you might tolerate videos because it's not as potentially as disruptive. It just depends on the difficulty and the gameplay nature. But I think all of those are keys to serving the correct type of ad and having it be relevant. Because at the end of the day, the best ads are the ones that are reaching someone who actually goes, oh, okay, that is actually interesting, or that's tapping on something I was thinking about, or I would also be inclined to play.
There will be big differences in terms of the appetite for, those monetization models where people aren't required to put their hands in their pockets across the different countries of the world. So can you give us any kind of insight into where ads are still being, well regarded?
Interestingly, I think it's also a function of the type of game as well. So we still see, casual and hyper casual being a great area. We've seen some success with, I believe Army Commander was a game that offered essentially like an in-app subscription to remove ads, and actually saw they kind of created a new revenue stream going the opposite way. And that's actually an interesting one because we do see, for instance, with YouTube, that a significant amount of revenue is generated through the app stores by people in markets like in the US, being a big market there, opting to pay to remove the ads. So I think kind of an inverse of that is another interesting area. We do see ads working exceedingly well, like I said, in some of the more simple gameplay, shorter sessions, hyper casual being the genres. We see ads also working particularly well in other more emerging mobile markets like Brazil and India, some parts of Southeast Asia, where you can just shift that burden of cost instead of paying for in-game currencies. Having the ads helps to kind of keep them free. So those are some other areas. I do think there's some really creative ways you can leverage ads in your strategy, and then create additional revenue streams by having people elect to pay to remove in some of the markets if you're targeting like Australia or the US or the UK.
See, that's so interesting, because one of the things that we've found, one of the things we've discussed with some of our guests and that we write about on the pg.biz site is that it gives developers so many more options. To designing the monetization, choosing the monetization based around your genre, your target markets, really gives them a whole new range of weapons, as it were, to sort of get out and get in front of people and engage with the broadest audience they can. So I think for now, that brings us to the end. Peggy?
It brings us only to the end of this section, but of course we have more coming. That's what it's all about when you have a 2-part series. So in a way, it's don't go away. We'll be right back. We are also thrilled that our loyal listeners and fans like you have nominated PG.biz for the Listener's Choice honor in this year's British Podcast Awards. So go to the awards website and vote for our podcast. The deadline is Tuesday, the 5th of September. We're counting on you, and it would be fantastic to get your vote. This show is all about how to do your job better, how to make an amazing game, how to market it, and you have a say. So if you have a story or know someone we need to shine a light on, then we would love to hear from you.
We want to hear from you. We want to reflect the reality of the mobile games market in all its wonderful complexity and strangeness. So if you have any suggestions for us, if you have any feedback for us, you can always get in touch. You can email us at podcast@pocketgamer.biz. You can find us on Twitter @PGBiz, and you can reach out to us through the pocketgamer.biz website. If you're interested in listening to all of our podcasts, you can find them at pocketgamer.biz/podcast, and we would love to hear your thoughts on future shows.
And we've got you covered on all the major platforms, so subscribe to the audio podcast, as Brian said. Look for us on YouTube. If you want to read it, hey, you can do that too, because we have a companion post for you as well on the pocketgamer.biz website.
Tune in again for the next edition of the pocketgamer.biz podcast, and we look forward to speaking to you in the near future. Until then, I'm Brian Baglow.
I'm Peggy Salz, and that's a wrap until next week.